So let's talk about the Israeli terrorist attack in Lebanon and the people who are defending it. This part is going to be specifically about the initial pager bomb attack. First, I just want to say the most important thing about this, which is that you need to remember that when you see people talking about this and justifying it, you're not dealing with people who are genuinely interested in having a discussion about whether it was justified or whether it was legal or not. You're dealing with people who are just trying to justify anything that Israel does, no matter what. You're dealing with essentially genocide inciting propagandists, okay? You have to remember that's where they're coming from, every time. Do not assume good faith of any of these people. You are wrong. You are wrong to do that. They are just what they are interested in doing is justifying anything that Israel does, no matter what. And the way that you can easily prove this is with a simple thought experiment. What would happen if suddenly a bunch of IDF soldiers who were off duty, or former IDF soldiers, or like bureaucrats in the Israeli government, whatever, suddenly got blown up wherever they were? You know, maybe they were at home with their family, maybe they were in a supermarket, maybe they were in a restaurant, and suddenly all of them just explode. How would the pro-Israel people who are justifying this attack react to that? What would their narrative be? It would be, this is the third Holocaust. That is how they would frame it. So do not for a single second imagine that you're dealing with people who are approaching this from anything, or even anything resembling so-called good faith, or people who are genuinely interested in some sort of discussion about the morality or the legality of what they did. The thing that makes this justified or not for them is the fact that Israel is doing it. It's the fact that the genocidal ethno state that they support is doing something to one of its victim groups, which is the Lebanese. Obviously, they're not as much of a victim group as Palestinians are, but make no mistake, their allyship for Palestinians has brought them great suffering over the years at the hands of the Israelis. It's Nazi logic. Okay, that's what it is. Anything that we do is justified because of the group that we are. And these people are inferior to us, and we want what they have for ourselves. So we need to justify everything that we do to them no matter what. And of course, you have the usual suspects trying to justify this. Like, it's actually crazy that Lonerbox ever tried, for example, just to use a really obvious example, ever tried to frame himself as a pro-Palestinian when the depths of like the justifications that he's going towards to justify anything that Israel does is now justifying the clearest examples of like possible of like violations of international humanitarian law, which liberals like him usually try to cite and justify. Lonerbox had a debate where he basically said verbatim, more or less, that Israel should be allowed to violate international law because how else are you supposed to fight Hezbollah or Hamas? You have to violate international law to fight them, thereby Israel is allowed to do it. And it's like, okay, for one, no, you don't have to violate international law to fight Hezbollah because Hezbollah is an armed regular military group, so that's just wrong. And for two, it comes with like this rhetorical trick that they use where you have to present them with some viable way through which Israel could fight these groups as if what Israel does in this case as an occupier, as a clear aggressor, is in any way justified. And again, you can easily dissect this by asking the questions of, well, if you ask them, okay, so what way is Russia allowed to fight Ukraine? What way is Russia allowed to carry out its invasion of Ukraine according to you? They would say, it's not allowed to do that. It's only allowed to leave. Every single time they would tell you that. The only right that Russia has in Ukraine is to get the fuck out. And that's my position as well. But the thing is, when it comes to Israeli aggression, when it comes to Israeli colonialism, when it comes to Israeli invasions, Israeli atrocities, their response is like, well, what else are they supposed to do? So again, do not try to respond to these people based on any sort of assumption of good faith. Don't argue with them on their own terms. They have no principles. They have nothing that they're abiding by here. No consistency, no nothing. The only consistent principle that they have is I have to defend Israel no matter what it does, and no matter how much this is clearly inconsistent with the rest of the beliefs that I claim to uphold. There was a particularly telling moment in like Lonerbox attempting to justify this, which I thought was absolutely incredible, and I'll show you this now. So he was attempting to justify this attack, and just before I continue, I want to explain how this is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, which is basically international law regarding war. It's really very simple. So first things first, you need to understand that international law was made as a result of World War One, basically. It was a long time coming, but was basically impulsed by World War One, when European colonizer countries all came together and said, chaps, the shit that we're doing to each other is a bit fucked up. We need to regulate it a bit. And unfortunately, a consequence of that was that in order to sort of maintain this charade of, they only really cared about it in regards to their own conflicts between each other, they also had to apply it to everyone else as well, or at least pretend to do so. So in situations where they clearly thought that it was fine to use poison gas and shit, like against colonized people, they sort of had to pretend to back that up there as well, rather than just, in a conflict between like Germany and France or whatever. So that's basically how international law developed. And over time, it obviously changed and it evolved into what it is today. But it's important to understand that international law, like law regarding war crimes and such, the point of it is basically for that. It's the limit of what is allowed in conflicts between like the world's most powerful empires, basically. And since then, it has sort of evolved in a way that is also meant to justify to allow the practices of these states, and also to criminalize the practices of the irregular forces that they have mostly fought. Because obviously, if you look at most of the conflicts between imperialist countries and like colonized countries throughout like the 20th century, for example, they were technically state actors, and they were fighting against colonized people who technically had not, under international law, formed a recognized state yet. And international law is pretty much set up to disadvantage you in that circumstance. But the thing is, so international law is basically set up to legitimize a lot of what like the most powerful countries do, and to delegitimize the actions of like people who are resisting in situations where they have no option but to resist in different ways than being like a formal, uniformed, organized military or whatever, Nonetheless, the thing is, you can very easily, I don't need to appeal to this sort of argument in the vast majority of these cases, because on these people's own terms, because Lonerbox, if you asked him, for example, he would 100% tell you that he supports international law. And that's fine, because I don't need to shift away from international law. In this case, I'm happy to argue on their own terms, because under international humanitarian law, this is the most obvious case of an indiscriminate attack imaginable. Because even if we accept the thesis that these pages were bought by Hezbollah 6 months ago or whatever it was, so Hezbollah is not just a militant organization, it's also a political party. It's basically like a pseudo-government. Most of the people in Hezbollah who work for them or whatever are civilians. They're bureaucrats, doctors, teachers, community workers, whatever. They're not actually armed militants. So you do not know what these pages were for. You do not know that these pages were only for military use. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you cannot possibly know where every single one of these pages were when you exploded them. Who had them, even if they were a militant. You have clear videos that prove this, obviously. You have pages exploding in supermarkets, pages exploding in houses. 2 of the 12 people who were killed in the initial explosions were children. And by the way, that is a significantly worse ratio than the amount of children killed in the October 7th attacks, if you want to talk about discriminate attacks versus indiscriminate attacks. And it's blatantly obvious that when you do this, you basically give out a bunch of bombs and then explode them 6 months later without having any way of knowing who had them and where they actually were at that time. It is incredibly obvious that you are going to kill civilians. It is incredibly obvious that is going to happen, so it's very obviously an indiscriminate attack. There's also many other ways that you could argue how these pages could have gotten into other people's hands. Like, that's just not how supply chains work. Like, you don't get 5,000 pages arriving into a country and they all immediately go to militants and no one else. Of course not. In Lebanon especially, where pages are very often used, you cannot guarantee where these pages would be. People could have stolen them and sold them. People could have lost them. That's even aside from the obviously already sufficient argument of saying Hezbollah is not only a military organization, and even if it was, these militants are not always going to be active combatants. That's another thing. There's a difference between an active combatant and an inactive combatant. Like a guy in a barracks sleeping, okay, you could argue that attacking the barracks is fine because he's in a fucking barracks. In 2 seconds, he could be ready for combat. However, as I said at the beginning of this segment, what happens when that same guy goes home for the weekend or whatever? He has like a 2-week break or whatever. He might be a member of a militant organization, but he's not a combatant anymore. And I guarantee you, as I said, if a bunch of like IDF members or former IDF members or whatever were attacked in their homes when they were technically not at work or whatever, not, fulfilling their role as soldiers, these people would call it a second fucking Holocaust. Lonerbox would call it a second Holocaust. We know that, it's obvious. It is very clearly the clearest war crime imaginable. And to give you an idea of just how indefensible it is, I want to show you probably the most ridiculous moment from Lonerbox having like a 5-hour-long debate where he tried to defend the notion. I don't think he didn't really even try to defend the notion that it wasn't a war crime. Rather, he tried to argue that Israel should be allowed to do war crimes because it's the only way for them to fight Hezbollah. That's like saying, well, what do you expect? The Nazis had to execute random people because how are they supposed to know who else was in the French resistance? How are they supposed to know who else was like a Jewish partisan? What do you expect? Come on, you can't set such unreasonable standards for the fucking Nazis. And this is generic Israeli propaganda strategy. Avoid context, avoid history. Just frame things as like, Israel is like a legitimate actor and their opponents are illegitimate actors. And you avoid any sort of context, history, or anything that shows you that the opposite is, if anything, what is true here. So, at one point in his insane debates, because he has no evidence for his defense, obviously, he comes up with this insane hypothetical where, but if they were 90% militants, 10% civilians, then would the attack be okay? What if later the IDF comes out and says that was the case? Would you accept it? And lest you think that I'm joking, that this guy essentially creates a hypothetical and then treats it as if it's proof of his claim. Here he is saying it.
I've got my audience. What's the point of me just letting you ramble? Can I ask my question again? Yeah.
Look at this. Oh my God, look at the aesthetic of leftism behind him. Kick fascism out of football. General strike now. Anarchist symbol. Dude, you are a right-winger. You are a Zionist. You supported a fucking fascist ethno-state. With the logic of fascism. You use it every single day. It's amazing. Like his self-image, the way that he tries to sell himself compared to what he actually is and what he actually believes and what he clearly states that he believes is so out of line. Honestly, it really reminds me of recently, like the fascist, racist, anti-Muslim protests in England, like the riots a couple of weeks ago. One of like the white nationalist groups had like an A symbol, an anarchist symbol on one of their signs. He is exactly like that. The self-perception versus the reality is so out of fucking whack, man. Anyway, let's listen to his incredible argument.
Okay, let's say that they knew.
Can you see me? I'm not watching you.
Let's say they knew it was going to be, say, like a 90% ratio. They were going to kill 90% militants, 10% civilians. Would it be fine then?
Let's say that they knew. Let's say this thing that I have no evidence for, that it is obviously impossible for them to have known by the very nature of this attack. Let's not look at the actual evidence of what happened, which is they killed fucking doctors on duty. They killed children. 10%, not even. And if that's your ratio of what would be acceptable, then how do you square 56% of the deaths in Gaza thus far being clear non-combatants, being the elderly, children, and women? Where does your own logic go here? Isn't it funny how he doesn't have evidence that supports what he wants to believe, so he just concocts it from thin air as a hypothetical, as if it's practically equal to evidence, then look at the face that he's making. Look at this fucking face that he's making. Jesus. He brings up this point multiple times, too. If you want the actual answer to this question, like, what would make this attack okay? Fucking nothing. Nothing would make it okay, and you know that. He knows that very well because of how he would react if it was done to Israel. It is pure ethno-nationalism. It is an ethno-nationalist fascist phalangist who comes from a Lebanese Christian family. The fact that he calls himself Lebanese and tries to appeal to that as his identity, by the way, is incredible. But basically, he is part of a group of people in Lebanon, for those of you who do not know, who consider themselves like above other Lebanese. They consider themselves like Phoenicians, and they consider non-Christian Lebanese to be below them. And they have, since even before Israel was founded, been enthusiastic supporters of Israel because of this idea that Israel could help them to like ethnically cleanse Lebanese, or to ethnically cleanse Lebanon of Muslims, etc., and people who they don't consider a part of their group. That is where he comes from. That is where this irrational, like, devotion to Israel that he upholds, no matter what, comes from. It's very important that you know that you realize that, and that you learn how to spot these people. It's specifically a Lebanese phenomenon. There's like a disproportionate, not majority in any means, maybe like 10% of Lebanese people who come from that demographic. And they will defend Israel no matter what. But I mean, to call him Lebanese is very generous. He's Scottish. He's a Scot who appeals to like his ancestry to try to give himself some more legitimacy occasionally. It's like as if I was to tell you that I am Greek and therefore I support Turkey and Turkey should invade Greece tomorrow and reestablish the Ottoman Empire. He's that. It's the same exact thing. He's the guy, basically, a guy who's like has a Ukrainian father, and he's there in 1941 telling you all about like how the resistance in Poland are evil terrorists, and asking you like these rhetorical questions of, well, come on, man, what are the Nazis supposed to do against the partisans? What are they supposed to do against the Polish resistance? Give me an acceptable thing that you think they're allowed to do. And the answer is there, for one, that's obviously a bullshit question in the first place, because the act itself is against the very international law that people like this claim to uphold and claim to abide by. Because usually it advantages them, but Israel is so depraved that in this case it really doesn't. And two, what are the Nazis allowed to do in Poland? Fucking nothing! Nothing! That's what the Nazis are allowed to do in Poland. Absolutely fucking nothing. They try to reduce this to like some sort of decontextualized legitimate conflict, as if Hezbollah has not been attacking Israel in response to what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not like some one-sided terrorist attack as they want to frame it. It is a response from an ally of people being subject to fucking genocide. In that case, is Israel allowed to retaliate against anything that they do? No. He was definitely afraid of just owning his Nazism. He's not going to tell you why he believes what he believes. He's not going to tell you why he advocates for what he advocates. He's not going to tell you why he just so happens to support everything that Israel does and just so happens to attack and delegitimize anything that he's done in response. It's because of the ethnicity of who's doing it. That is the only factor that he truly considers. And it is very plainly obvious now that he is defending clear war crimes and denying the clear and obvious genocide in Gaza, which he's been doing for weeks now. There is no coming back for anyone who even remotely claims that this guy is anything but a fascist. He is not just a fascist in the Mussolini style, he's a fascist in the Hitler style. Clear, unambiguous ethno-fascist who decides between what is right and wrong based on the ethnicity of who is carrying it out. But as I said at the beginning, never assume good faith of people who argue ridiculous shit, like the idea that blowing up a bunch of 5,000 pages or whatever it was, that are in the hands of an organization that is essentially a pseudo-government, that is also full of civilians, with no regard for where they could potentially be at the time when they were exploded. Never assume that someone who is defending that is doing it based on good faith, is doing it because they genuinely care about international law, or they actually want to have like a genuine argument about it, or that they're just misled. They are doing it because they support no matter what the perpetrator does. Anything the perpetrator does, no matter what, they support it. It's as simple as that. It's wrong even by their own standards, even by their own standards of like liberal international law. So they just abandon that standard entirely and be like, well, you know, sometimes you just got to crack a few eggs. It's okay for Israel to break international law because apparently their opponents make it impossible for them not to. And when you're arguing that, you are a fucking Nazi. It's that simple. When you're arguing that without stopping to think beforehand, hold on, am I maybe the baddie here if I'm arguing that even international law is too limiting? International law crafted by imperial powers to legitimize their own practices is too limiting for Israel? If you're at the point of arguing that and you don't stop and say, you know, maybe I'm the fascist here, maybe I'm the Nazi here, I think it's because you're conscious of the fact that that's who you are and you're just too afraid to admit it. There's really no other option.